Hello ladies and gentlemen, today I'm going to be helping you determine whether or not Next Hero is worth your money. At the time of this review, the game is available on the Steam marketplace for about $6 US where I live. You'll have to bear in mind that I live in Asia, and thus prices for you on the Steam marketplace will not be the same for me. Without further ado, let's dive into the review. You play what is essentially a nameless hero who is embarking on a quest to exact vengeance against a dragon that has more or less kidnapped his girlfriend and destroyed the village that they live in. This sounds eerily similar to the old classic dungeon crawlers that you would find on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System and other games at the time. This is more or less the same village that you start out in-game. However, one thing that you should know is that all of the NPCs in-game are nameless, and further, the village that you first begin in is in a much more dilapidated state. Your hero will also cause destruction to pretty much anything in the environment that isn't necessary simply by bumping into it. Look at it this way, at least you don't have to spend time swinging a sword at a bunch of empty pots to get them to break. Let's get back to the village and the progression system that comes with it. As I said before, the village is in a much more dilapidated state in the very beginning of the game. However, I was unable to start over from the beginning and show you guys what that's like from start to finish. So what happens is you go through dungeon crawls, and 90% of the time, those dungeon crawls are going to result in you dying. I wouldn't be surprised to find out that you guys die 2 or 3 times before you finish the first dungeon. However, you're simply not able to go back to town in between dungeons, so therefore the game has you stuck on a rail system until you die, and thus take all of your gold and whatever you looted in the dungeon back to town. So if you just finished a dungeon crawl and you want to heal up, well, unfortunately, you're going to have to use the shops that are in the dungeon to get healed. Let's talk a little bit about the rebuilding system in game. So basically this building that I'm inside now is the first one that you will end up rebuilding. And then what you can do is you can change the costume on your character and also his attack. As you noticed, I was able to switch from what was a sword that you would throw into a sword that is used purely for melee purposes. In my opinion, this isn't entirely bad because this gives the player multiple choices as to how they want to tackle a situation. However, if you're like me and you want to be able to clear a room very quickly, then you will very likely want to go ahead and just grab the melee costume, since the damage that you inflict is clearly enough to kill an enemy on the first blow in the first dungeon. And real quick, the layout of each dungeon is entirely determined by RNG. So this means that loot that you can pick up in addition to enemies that you can encounter, as well as where the boss chamber is in-game, is entirely randomized. So although there is going to be that tedious chore of beating the first dungeon and then progressing to the second dungeon, this is a process that will not be entirely boring and repetitive. However, you should expect to die a lot and then play through the first dungeon a lot. My advice to you is if you are going to be a new player playing this game, then you can count on making the best of the first dungeon. That is to say, since you can't go back to town, you should consider trying to get as many power-ups as you can in the first dungeon, as well as keys and other goodies, bombs, to prepare you for the next dungeon. There is actually a great deal of player strategizing. For example, once you beat the dungeon boss, you have the choice to continue exploring the dungeon or immediately move on to the next dungeon. And items that you have not picked up, for example, this piece of health, will forever remain in that dungeon. So once you've beaten the boss, if you're not at full HP, you can go back and pick up more HP. There are also items that you can pick up in each dungeon crawl that only benefit you if you are at town. For example, you guys just saw me pick up a wooden staff that was on the ground for a while, and that can be used to construct a weapon at the blacksmith once you've got that building built. Also, let's talk about shopping while in the dungeon. As you can see, I'm breaking down a bunch of bushes and trees and random pots, trying to find gold that can be used at the in-dungeon item shop. Items that appear in the item shop in dungeons can vary anywhere from, say, a heart, that is to say, refilling your HP, to a stack of bombs or a stack of keys. And now that you guys see that we're in the middle of a boss fight, it would be a good idea to go ahead and explain this to you. This is actually the easiest boss that you can run across in the first dungeon. As you can see, he just randomly blobs around and you go whacking him with your sword or your projectile weapon of choice. However, you could alternatively end up facing off against a giant plant monster or a giant lynx. In dungeon crawls themselves, you can encounter all kinds of power-ups and spells and everything else in between that you can think of. You can mix and match as many different spells and power-ups as you can possibly think of. However, you are permitted to carrying only one spell scroll at a time. These spell scrolls could do anything from putting all of the dungeon enemies to sleep to just making them move slower. I also failed to neglect that you can seemingly pick up almost any number of weapons in the game in each dungeon crawl. As far as I can tell thus far, I have not been limited to the number of weapons that I can carry, and each one functions differently. You can carry a boomerang, you can carry this spellcaster, this wand that fires off fireballs, as you see me doing here, or a crossbow. You know, you can, they really went wild with their imagination in terms of projectile weapons in game. However, this still doesn't get us past the fact that there is one very frustrating point with this game that really stuck with me for a while, and that is just getting to the final dungeon. You guys have probably noticed that now that I'm in the second dungeon, I'm using more projectile weapons as opposed to the sword that does more damage. And this is just for the simple reason that I feel as though I want to play more safely than sorry. Each dungeon with it brings itself a new set of enemies and obstacles and danger to encounter for the player. And even though it is challenging to some extent, it's still somewhat frustrating to encounter this as a player. I'm pretty sure I also mentioned early on in this video that I never managed to make it past the third dungeon. However, if you see that as a massive problem, then you can simply hire someone else to take the dungeon for you, that is to say, a mercenary. However, you'll find yourself asking the question, is this worth it as opposed to using my own default character? The reason being is that if you hire a mercenary, it could cost you all of the gold that you just earned in a previous dungeon crawl and died from. One more thing about the dungeon crawls is that it would seem that there are like these little kind of gladiator arena places where you can pay half of a heart, that is to say your own HP, to go in and purchase a power-up, assuming that you are going to survive that fight. You'll see that very shortly here with the mercenary that I'm using. And there are other stores that I did not encounter in this playthrough that will allow you to pay for items using HP. I haven't beaten the game yet, but I think I'm ready to come to a verdict. After playing this game for a few days, I'd say somewhere in the range of less than a week, more than 3 days, I am ready to present the following critique as well as rating. Something I failed to mention earlier is that at some points in the game your controls do feel a little bit clunky. That is to say, whenever you're moving and firing a projectile at the same time, that can influence the direction that the projectile flies out to initially. Adding to the slight hassle that is the control scheme, there are times that you would think that your mouse is north facing versus your character. However, as a human being, the mistake that we make is that we misidentify that the reticule is north-facing and instead east-facing or west-facing. So occasionally you'll be firing off shots that are not in the direction that you want them to go in. In this playthrough, I did nothing but use the mouse and keyboard. However, it's entirely possible to play the game using 2 hands on the key. So with that in mind, I think this game is best suited for people who already have a gamepad for their PC. Another negative, as I mentioned before, is simply the number of times you will die and the number of times you will be attempting to get to the 3rd or 4th dungeon or whatever have you. This goes down as a negative in my book because, well, who's going to keep on playing a game if they know that they can't win or they find it astoundingly difficult to win in, even with a hired mercenary? That's pretty much going to wrap things up for the negatives. Now let's go on to the pros for this game. I grew up in the 90s, so replayability is actually something that you don't encounter all that often. Back in my day, when we were playing side-scrolling shooter games and dungeon crawlers and things of that nature, enemies were always in the same location. And having a little bit of randomness up to and including the boss that you face in each dungeon is actually a nice little twist. It keeps the player kind of waiting for more, if you will. And if you've made it this far into the video, that means that you would know that the first green blob that I faced was nothing like this big green goblin earlier on. Another thing that encourages replayability is rebuilding the village at the very start of the game. It could be that since I haven't beaten the game, there might be an element of the game that I've missed thus far since I haven't gotten back to fully rebuilding the village that we start out in. Another positive is, in the very beginning when you play this game, you start to have this kind of just one more time kind of feel. And what I mean to say is, if you've played Geometry Wars Retro Evolved, you know exactly what kind of feeling I'm talking about. One final pro that I can think of is that pretty much any computer can run this game in 2019. So the hardware requirements really aren't that high and you get some decent gameplay value out of it. So do the pros make up for the cons in this situation? In the end, I can tell you, I personally think that this game is only worth it if it's available on a Steam sale or if it's a part of another game bundle that you purchased from a CD key website. That's going to wrap up our review of Next Hero. If you guys thought this video was worth your time listening to, make sure to leave me a like and a comment or a question about the game if you have one. If you guys like the idea of unbiased game reviews, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell. I will try and bring you guys some more videos like these in the future. That's it from me. This is Binge 4K out.